Hello, my name is Haley, and I am going to be presenting for you today my biggest impact athlete, Althea Gibson. And before I get started, I just want to point out that this PowerPoint presentation, you may notice, is pretty simplistic. I intentionally wanted to use a lot of black and white and gray, and my intention behind this was to be a little symbolic and true to Althea's nature, which you'll learn about a little bit more. But Althea was a very black and white, no frill around the edges kind of person. And so even with how I wanted to physically represent her through this presentation, I just wanted to pay homage to her in that way a little bit too. So Althea's early life. So she was born in South Carolina in 1927, the oldest of five children. So there were seven in the home, including her mother and father. And when we think about that in the 1920s, the Gibson family was living on a cotton farm. And like many other Americans at the time, were greatly impacted by the Great Depression and their crops being destroyed, not making enough money. And so in 1930, when Althea was 3, the Gibson family, along with many other black families throughout the country, relocated to New York in the hopes of just more opportunity. The Gibson family would move into the Harlem development in a small apartment with all 7 of them. And Harlem at the time, while it had kind of the artistic scene and maybe looks similar in the way to what we think of Harlem now in that capacity, Harlem was very underdeveloped. This was a community where even the police officers would close down the street so children could play. So a lot of kids out and about, pretty underserved community. And with that being said, Althea was always found outside playing sports, often with boys. She would play basketball, she would play paddle tennis. She was a very active person from a very young age. Like I said, Althea is not like a frill, kind of rough around the edges person, so she was very aggressive. She would not back down from a fight. She would often fight with a lot of the boys around the area. Althea would also skip school all the time. A lot of this was due to her just finding school really boring and pointless at times, but at her school in Harlem, there was still segregation happening. So she was in a segregated school. And often what she would do is she would either go by the subway, or she loved going to the movies. She dreamed of being a star, a singer, and an actor, which she dabbles in a little bit later in her life. And she dropped out of school at 13 years old and would not go back to school until much later, graduating from high school, 10th in her class at the age of 21. And so thinking about this, there were these years, this period of time where Althea truly was a street kid. She would try to pick up odd jobs here and there. She would box and scrap with her dad. Something that I think was pretty minimized when I was doing research on Althea was she was physically abused by her dad, and she openly talks about that in her autobiography. But thinking about the time period when it was, I don't think it was looked down as upon or taboo in the way we think of abuse now. She would often try to run away from home multiple times to escape his abuse, and eventually in the 40s, when she would move out of New York to practice her tennis career, she would have some separation. Though she does still have a positive relationship with her parents, including her father later on in her life as well. They were very happy for her success as a tennis star. So how Althea kind of got that taste for victory, right? So she won her first medal, winning a paddle tennis competition at 9 years old. And when she was 13, she caught the eye of Buddy Walker. He was a musician from Harlem, also played tennis at a prestigious all-black tennis club, a cosmopolitan club, and he was very impressed with her athletic ability and thought she had a lot of potential. So he wanted to give her the opportunity to train. And so she would start taking lessons the next year from Fred Johnson in 1942, entering her first tournament. In 1947, so just 5 years later, she would go on to win 10 straight tournaments for the American Tennis Association, which was an all-black association for tennis players, founded so they could have their own place. It was still very segregated as far as the tennis world. So as she was achieving success, she really had hopes of trying to make an appearance at the U.S. national competition, which we now know as the U.S. Open. But she was feeling discouraged because she wasn't being invited, and how the U.S. Open worked at the time was it was invite-only basis, and a lot of the times the invites would be based off a point system from winning tournaments that were most of the time held at tennis clubs that were exclusive for white people. So she didn't have that advantage like some of the other stars were that would be invited. With the protesting from the American Tennis Association and a very well-known white tennis star at the time, Alice Marble, who had a very impressive editorial campaigning for Althea to be able to be invited to compete. She would be able to in 1950, but she would not win at the time. However, her appearance was still impressive because she lost to the reigning champion at Wimbledon for the past 3 years. Althea was invited to go on a Goodwill Ambassador Tour in Southeast Asia in 1955 and would have the opportunity to compete against other players in other countries, and she would credit this tour later as being very crucial to developing her skills that would help her later go on to win Wimbledon and the U.S. Open. And one of the achievements of one of her early firsts for Althea was that she became the first black woman to win the Grand Slam at the French Open in 1957. So, in Althea's autobiography, she wrote that she wanted to make 1957 Althea's year. She finally achieved that success when she made history as the first black person, man or woman, to win Wimbledon championship. This was the first time that the Queen of England had been at Wimbledon, so it was very impactful for Althea, thinking this was a girl that grew up in the slum and streets of Harlem to now in 1957 shaking the hand with the Queen. Althea would then, that same year, just a few weeks later, finally win the U.S. national tournament as well. Althea held on to her reign as the best tennis player in the world, going on to win Wimbledon the following year in 1958 as well. And I also want to mention that in addition to winning the singles competition, she was also winning championships for doubles tennis competitions with partners as well. So life after Wimbledon. So in 1958, after she won her second Wimbledon tournament, she shocked everybody when she announced that she would be retiring, because this was still amateur tennis. She wasn't making money. She says in her autobiography, like, winning is great, but you can't eat a crown. And the IRS likes to have cold hard cash, right? And so with it not seeming like there were prospects of turning pro, she wanted to go back and try a career in some of her earlier passions, like movies, singing. She would put out an album called Althea Gibson Sings, and she would also star in a movie alongside John Wayne However, these careers were not very fruitful for her, so she did not make much of an impact and was not in these careers long term. In 1964, Althea joined the Ladies Professional Golf Association, the LPGA, with the hopes of having a successful career in golf. She could not give up sports quite yet, and she thought she could really make an impact. And at the time, in 1964, she would be the first black woman to join the LPGA. And she experienced a little bit of success as a golfer, but not enough to win tournaments. She was just not successful at golf in the way she was in tennis. She retired in 1977, but continued playing for leisure. And she would often reflect that she probably came into golf too late in age. She was in her 30s at the time. But, of course, not a surprise to note that people that did observe her play golf were still impressed with her athletic ability. She would then go on to become an advocate and speaker on nutrition, physical fitness, education. She established a foundation in her name. She would run tennis clinics and mentor and teach tennis to underserved youth. She was involved in so much, tried to do so much after Wimbledon, I think partially because she still had that successful drive and wanted to be high achieving and kept looking for opportunities where she would be appreciated. At one point, she would try to run for senator in New Jersey. She would not win. And she would actually become the first black woman to be appointed the state athletic commissioner in New Jersey. And sadly, in September 28, 2003, after very privately battling back-to-back bladder and respiratory infections, she passed away. So, the social and historical context of Althea Gibson's impact. So going back to 1950, the U.S. Nationals at Forest Hills, this was so significant because this sport of tennis was not meant for someone like Althea, right? When we think of tennis, and there's even a documentary that I watched on her where they're saying there's white balls, there's white tennis outfits, it's all very white, and thinking of that symbolism of this was a place, a sport that still is considered today to be people that come from privilege and wealth that can't afford to participate in the sport. So she was really monumental in being someone that did not fit that mold. And she also, in 1950, when she did make this appearance of the U.S. National, would be just 3 years after Jackie Robinson had broken the color barrier in baseball. And so, such an incredible time for the black community to witness these athletes breaking these barriers within a relatively short time frame. She would continue to break barriers in the 50s. She would become, as I mentioned earlier, the first black person to win a tennis tournament. This one would be in Miami, which at the time was still being deeply affected by the Jim Crow laws, so pretty significant win. She would, as I said, be invited to go on this Goodwill Ambassador tour. She was the only black person that had been invited as a tennis player. And Althea didn't realize this, which I'll go into a little bit later, but her participation in this tour would be propaganda from the United States to push this narrative that the country was more racially equal than they actually were. That was very much not the case. The same year she went on this tour was the same year that Emmett Till had horrifically died at the age of 14, being attacked and lynched. So the significance at Wimbledon, her win at Wimbledon was her most impactful and most well-known contribution to the sport of tennis, being the first black player ever in its 80-year history to have won a tournament. She, of course, received heckling and some derogatory slurs from people in attendance, but she was so celebrated. for her achievements. She received a celebratory ticker tape parade in New York, being only the second Black person in history to have received one, and she would, unfortunately, despite all this success, she would not receive a celebratory parade in 1958 after winning Wimbledon. She was really feeling like she was fading into the background. Here she was seeing other tennis players who were white, of course, but that she was much better at, and they were receiving endorsements and offers for pro, and she was not. So this was a harsh realization that she faced, thinking, well, maybe I was not making progress for the Black race in the way that she had liked to have seen. So, as I mentioned previously in her history, again, some more firsts for Althea being the first Black woman to become a member of the LPGA. This was also pretty significant because at the time, the PGA, the Men's Association, did still have clauses put in place excluding Black people for participating. So this was very impactful not only for Black women, but Black men as well. As I mentioned, she became the first woman in the country appointed to a state athletic commissioner in New Jersey. Unfortunately, she would only be in this position for about a year before being cut due to budget cuts, and she was devastated by this. This was a very heartbreaking loss for her. She was really hoping to make an impact for creating jobs, increasing interest in sport, and she was not able to do that. And in 1991, Althea would be awarded the Theodore Roosevelt Award from the NCAA, the first woman in the country to receive such an award, and she is still the first woman and only woman to have received it since. So thinking about the social and historical context, right? So Althea was a tomboy growing up, and she would continue to not really adhere to what was expected of her being a woman tennis player. You know, she would prefer to wear shorts versus a skirt or a dress, and she would not style her hair. She would always be criticized for her appearance in the news media, and as I mentioned here in this slide, her aggressive style of play became suspicious to so many that reportedly she had to undergo gender testing, in 1957 to prove she did not have an extra chromosome. Althea never had children, and she spent most of her life unmarried, and so thinking about her appearance and presentation and her romantic life, there was a lot of speculation that Althea was actually a lesbian. And at the time, it was just a little taboo to think about women really wanting just to pursue a career versus a romantic relationship. So Althea's impact on the current landscape of sport and society. So positive impact. So obviously her historic achievements at Wimbledon and the US Open and other competitions was so impactful for the Black community because they had never seen themselves in tennis and being represented on such a platform outside of these associations that they created for themselves. Althea would inspire athletes such as Arthur Ashe, who was the first Black man to win in Wimbledon in 1975, and is still to this day the only Black man that has ever achieved that championship. Billie Jean King, who is very well known in the tennis community and as an athlete for her advocacy work on the feminist movement, and of course Venus and Serena Williams. Venus actually put in the afterword of a biography written on Althea that had Althea not broken the racial barrier in tennis, she probably would not have had the opportunities that Venus and her sister had when Venus would then go on to win Wimbledon 40 years after Althea. And though her career in golf was not as fruitful as she hoped it would be, she was also an inspiration to many golf players that came after her and had great success, including the sports icon and probably most famous golfer in the world, Tiger Woods. She also represented, thinking about her gender and identity and presentation, how women could live and be in society unapologetically themselves, and being able to model a career-driven woman who was not attached to the idea of marriage. A lot of this was happening during the Cold War time. They were trying to kind of transition away from the narrative of women being wives and homemakers to being in the workforce. So this was very incredible for people to be able to see someone of such a high status doing that. And she, again, she was still criticized, which we still see in sports media, but what an inspiration for challenging those expectations, and that other women were getting to see that, even though she was being criticized for it. So with Althea Gibson, it's a little complex and challenging to think about negative impacts she had on the current sport environment. I think with Althea, maybe what could be perceived as more negative is that now she isn't as well known. When we think of impactful tennis stars, for many of us, Althea is not who comes to mind, and I think partially that could be attributed to her lack of advocacy throughout her life and career. At the time when there were Black people that were making significant impacts in the sports world, and they were very vocal in their activism. You can see her here. There's a picture of her with Jackie Robinson. The same year that Althea would win Wimbledon, Jackie Robinson would retire from baseball to pursue activism. And so she was given this platform and could have had an opportunity to really push for equality for Black people, for women, and a lot of the athletes that we think back on at the time were also known for being active in these social causes, but she was not. In her autobiography, she claims she's not a racially conscious person, and she did not want to be victimized by the color of her skin because she couldn't change it. In Althea's mind, she did not want to be identified as a Black tennis player, just simply a tennis player. And a lot of the media, specifically Black media, would call her things such as big-headed. She had an unbecoming attitude. And so there were a lot of people within the Black community that were really disappointed that Althea was not taking a stand on these issues. And then on the other hand, there were some people that understood and thought, I get it. You just want to be known for your accomplishments. You want your presence and your achievements to do the work for you. So player for propaganda. So her presence in the media was exploited and whitewashed, and this is still prevalent in today's sports media coverage. And thinking about from a theoretical perspective, studying the impacts of culture and sport, I think that her time in her 1955 ambassador tour and even film footage beyond that could be studied for the impact theoretically of the relationship between culture, what's projected, what's changed, what we receive, and sport. So the U.S. government would provide film coverage overseas through this program to portray an image of democracy, equality, and diversity. And so people would see Althea playing tennis at Wimbledon and winning, shaking hands with, at the time, Vice President Nixon when she won the U.S. Open, and being welcomed in that celebratory parade. And so what they did was they created a false narrative of racial equality and progression, and that was not the case. During this time when these films were being put out, they were controlled, edited films by white people, narrated by a white man. The players were not heard speaking. The players and figures that were actually in these films had no say. And so there was some exploitation where there could be a narrative that things were progressing in the country. And that was the total opposite. An irony of all of this, there were over 100 congressmen trying to uphold segregation in schools, backlash from Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, Emmett Till's death in 1955, as well as the Montgomery bus boycotts. So, being somebody, so in closing, was so in awe of Althea and just her resilience and determination. It was very inspiring. And so her story of rising from the economic, racial, and gender struggles, being that young, poor street kid in Harlem, to being known as the world's best tennis player, could be considered the epitome of the American dream, right? Althea was an inspiration to people from all backgrounds, not just the Black community, and paved the way for modern athletes that have been able to achieve greatness in their sports today. Althea wanted to win, and she wanted to be somebody, and although she is no longer with us, she continues to be somebody to so many people. So left a lasting legacy, indeed. Thank you so much for sticking around this long. These last two slides, I've just included references for the slide and also resources that I used when studying her, just in case anybody had any interest in doing some more research on Althea. I highly recommend it. She was such an interesting individual, and I hope that she makes an impact on you as well. Thank you.